everywhere we've been going, it's been like that. We'll sit in a restaurant and he'll be like, my wife would like. So we've been having a lot of fun with that. It's great to be here today. It's all God, it's all good. That's basically the underlying theme for any unity talk, the implicit, if not explicit theme. And, you can stay back on that. We'll talk a little bit about that. Welcome. Today is day 2 of a 5-talk series on the 5 basic unity principles. About a month ago when we were here, we talked about the first basic unity principle, which is essentially this, that there is indeed only one power and only one presence active in the entire universe and in our lives. God the good, in all, through all, and over all. And today's talk will be about the second basic unity principle, which really just logically flows from the first. If God is in all, through all, then necessarily you're it. So the title of today's talk, if we could change the slide, is Tag, You're It. There's good news and bad news. No, it's all good. So just to start off, 7 years ago, I served as the spiritual director for Kaiser Rehabilitation Center in Vallejo, California. Now, I know spiritual director has a very lofty sound to the title, but really my role was actually fairly modest. What I was invited by the administration to come in and do is to lead a weekly interfaith service. So this was for both patients and their families. This was a pilot program at the time at Kaiser, totally new and exciting for them. So basically, a lot of hospitals have a regular chaplaincy program, right, where the chaplain is there oftentimes to support people in their times of transitions, to support people in their families. But here, the hospital was doing something new and proactive, which is actually bringing in spirituality to affirmatively support the healing and spiritual transformation process of families and their patients. And later I found out that some of these administrators were actually unity people. And so they had this vision of doing this, of bringing this into the community. So I was naturally very excited at the time. This was my first ever paid ministerial job, but I was like 31, 32 years old. So, very young to my spiritual journey, young to all of this. I had been a member of Unity in Marin for about 3 years. And the reason that I even really accepted it, even though it was like fairly overwhelming, was that all the signs, when all the signs sort of point to, yes, it was basically being handed to me. I mean, I was practicing law full time, so I wasn't looking for a job. But basically, this woman who happened to be a minister in another tradition, but who was now in my prayer chaplain program with me, and who was also a spiritual counselor at Unity in Marin, basically was invited by Kaiser to do this. She decided that it wasn't what she wanted at that time in her life, and of all the people in the world, she came and recommended me. So she basically handed me this job. So I took on this job. And, I think as true of many of you who do sacred spiritual work for others, I found that as I began to do this job that was purportedly, in sacred service to these individuals, that I found that in the end, I was deeply served and grown by this process. I mean, I knew that the experience itself on the worldly sense would help me along my ministerial path. But what I didn't know was the extent to which the work that I did with these patients would actually alter me at the core and transform me and my relationship to myself. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that story here today. This talk today, Tag, You're It, comes in 2 parts. First, I'll explore the value in coming to see each of us as its, rather than as just he or she. And the idea of this is there's a difference between knowing what we are versus solely knowing who we are. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then second, so as I've been on this journey of awakening to a deeper knowing of like my true identity, and as I've had the opportunity to witness as well as guide others in the process, I found that one key barrier to this awareness is often our own self-judgment, our own blame, our own guilt in the process. So today I'm also going to talk about the role of self-forgiveness in coming to know who, or rather what, we truly are. So first, you're it. But so are you. And so are you, and so am I, right? Right? So you too, Victor. So Reverend Imelda Shanklin, who's the author of this Unity classic, What Are You? It opens her book with this really powerful and provocative statement. She says, or asks, what are you? Until you can answer this question promptly and correctly at any time that it is asked, you do not know yourself well enough to trust yourself, to be happy, to be assured of continued safety and well-being. What are you? Until you can answer this question promptly and correctly at any time that it is asked, you do not know yourself well enough to trust yourself, to be happy, to be assured of continued safety and well-being. This is a bold statement that Shanklin is making here. What does she mean? So she elaborates for us, telling us the story, whether it's real or just allegorical in here, I'm not sure. The story of meeting what she describes as an intelligent appearing, upstanding young man. And then asking him this question, what are you? And so naturally the man looks puzzled. And so she repeats the question, and he smiles politely back at her, thinking that she didn't actually just word the question properly. And so he informs her, I'm Johnny Doe, 22 years of age, popular, law student, a man you will hear from later, he says. Shanklin scribbles in her book, the man has not understood the question. He's translated my question from the impersonal to the personal. He fails to answer the deeper question. He has merely answered the question, who are you? According to Shanklin, this is how most of the world misapprehended Jesus Christ. His contemporaries saw and they said of him things like, wait, he's the son of the carpenter. Or even they might ascribe to him some mighty title like, oh yes, he is the promised Messiah. But it was only the Apostle Peter who was reported, at least, to have been the first to behold the truth of Jesus Christ's identity. At that time, Peter declares, thou art the Christ, the living Son of the living God. Thou art the Christ, the living child of the living God. This is from Matthew chapter 16, verse 16. And to this, Jesus Christ replies, blessed art thou, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father who is in heaven. Metaphysically, we can interpret this as saying, you didn't see this truth through your worldly eyes, but through your spiritual awareness. your consciousness of God, your heavenly consciousness. And it is this consciousness that I felt called or charged even to adopt in my role as the spiritual director at Kaiser in Vallejo. So the patients, just for clarity, the patients at this rehab center were people who had experienced things like spinal cord injuries and brain trauma. So these were fairly severe cases that I was looking at. Most of the people who came before me in the healing group were in wheelchairs, and some of them actually had to be wheeled in their beds because they couldn't move at that time. You know, many of them were on medications that made it even difficult for them to stay awake, but the nurses said they really still wanted to come to this healing service. In the course of my work there, I met a man in his teens who had experienced a severe paralyzing accident during a football game. So just a high school kid. There was another gentleman who was at this party, and he was just out on the balcony and fell 2 stories down. Another man shared with me that he had been a cab driver up until about 2 days ago. And now, according to the doctors, he would never walk, much less drive again. Those were the cases that I was looking at. So not only were their bodies, but these people's personal identities were broken, were shattered, right? These were people who told me that they were really independent in their lives, and they now had to just switch into a different role in which they were dependent on their nurses and on their family members, some of whom they didn't used to like all that much, and now they were learning to reconcile with that. So these people had fundamentally lost the sense of who they were before the accident. And I felt that, wow, you know, this is a ripe time, is it not? That in this opening, within this breakage of no longer being connected to who we were, we have the opportunity to open to a greater sense of what we are. When we're no longer as connected to who we were, we can open to this knowing of what we are. And from the unity perspective, I could then apply what I knew about these fundamental truths, these basic unity principles. There's one power and one presence. And every patient and every family member in that room, I could look at them and say, you're it, right? So I quickly realized, as I was like, how do I do this interfaith service, that it was my job not to convince them to see beyond, but it was my job to see beyond their personhood, certainly beyond the conditions of their bodies, and in many cases also beyond the conditions of their mental state and their psychological state, to see beyond that for what they truly are: spirit, infinite, whole, absolutely perfect. I could do that for them. And so that became my practice. In this, I relied so heavily on that second basic unity principle. No matter what each of these patients or people believed about themselves, I could hold their divinity. And as I supported these people through this major life transition that they were going through and their families were going through, I was actually going through my own. I was losing a sense of who I was. I was releasing my identity as a lawyer at this highfalutin, big-time law firm in San Francisco. And even though I never really liked the practice of law, it's like I didn't really realize until I started to lose that identity how much I was actually identified with it, attached to it for my sense of worth. So as I sort of moved away from that and I wasn't telling people anymore that I was that, I had to come into this knowing, like, who am I? What am I? Where does my worth come from? What's my identity? These are the questions that I was living with even as I was supporting these patients in their path, kind of coming into a knowing of who am I? What am I? What is my worth? So what are you? Sitting here today, can you answer that question? What are you? Can you answer it not only intellectually, to kind of report back to me, this is what I am, but to know it at your depths? To know it at such a depth of being that when your personhood gets shaken, there's this knowing of what you truly are that stands its ground, that roots you into your bliss, your peace, your joy. No matter what life circumstances do to alter your personhood, do you know your spiritual identity? So I remember really vividly the moment, actually, that I made a commitment to stop living on the surface of myself and actually go within to realize the depths of my being. As many of you already know, I entered my spiritual journey through the 12-step program of recovery. So I was working the steps at this time, and I was working this recovery from various addictions, including relationship addiction. And so part of my recovery meant that I was to do this period of celibacy, to totally abstain from all romantic relationships. And the idea behind this was that I wasn't going to stay distracted from my own being. I was going to turn within and actually, for the first time, get to know myself. So needless to say, I was scared. I was very scared. In fact, though the surface of my being looked very presentable, I had this sort of nagging fear that, and partly all of that surface stuff was to hide what I thought was really an ugly darkness inside of me, which was actually the truth of me that I was hiding from everybody. And so I call a gal in my 12-step program. I'm sitting in my office. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this. So I call her, and I express my fears. And I'm not used to sharing about myself, so I'm a little awkward at it at the time. But I remember saying something along the lines of, well, do other people worry about this? But or am I unique? But what if I get to know myself and I don't like what I see? What if I'm actually, well, you don't know me yet. What if I'm actually a bad person? How do you know? How do you know if I'm not? What if I'm actually a bad person? What if there's actually something wrong with me? What if I'm different from everyone else? So those are the fears that were going through my mind as I considered getting to know my true self. And so this woman loudly proclaims and assures me, oh, your fears are all normal, and oh, trust me, you're going to like what you see. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this. Okay, so she's, you're going to like what you see. Well, she was wrong. For months, I looked, and all I saw was anger and bitterness and sadness and guilt and shame, and it was ugly. It was ugly. At least that's how I judged it. But I was committed, and I was willing to sit with it. And it was this experience that leads me to bring up the second point and final point for today's talk, which is on the need for self-forgiveness. My second point for today, for the Your It talk, is this. Your it means that you're responsible for your life, but not to blame for it, not to be shamed for it. In the Bible, in Luke chapter 18, verse 19, even Jesus says this, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. So there's a difference here that's very important for us to make, a discernment. There's a difference between the person, the ego, and the spirit. Of this, Imelda Shanklin says that you are divine perfection is true of the impersonal, not the personal. The personal can and frequently does act ignorantly, sinfully. The impersonal never can be ignorant, never can sin. And just to be clear, in unity terms, all sin means is to miss the mark, to err in consciousness. This is the fundamental issue of the ego. The ego is not a bad thing, but what it does is it acts off a sin, a fundamental error in consciousness that believes that it has somehow managed to separate from the allness that is God. The ego believes that it has accomplished what is actually impossible. In the allness of God, there can be no individual, but the ego thinks, hey, I'm doing it on my own. But then here I am out on my own, and oh, where are the resources? Oh, I better take it from here and take it from there. And where's the love? I'm going to take it from you and take it from you, because the ego is not connected, does not know it's already here, bathed in the living spirit of all prosperity, good, God, love, peace, and joy. The ego is in it, but doesn't know it. So, when we begin to look at ourselves and stop blaming the outer world, what we see is this muck and guck created by that self that thought it was alone, right? And it's bad enough that even like the famous psychologist Carl Jung said that each man will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing his own soul. Because it's painful and it's difficult. And at the same time, at least in my personal experience, when I was willing to actually sit and feel, and then after feeling, finally like release all that baggage, all that anger and resentment and guilt and judgment and blame, when I could finally sit there, and it took months to do that, to just stay with that, I started to feel something within me that I can only describe as light. There was this lightness of being, this joy, this ecstasy, this peace of being. I'm like, that's me. Hidden behind all that stuff that I was previously unwilling to face because I thought I was bad. I was actually not able to then see how intrinsically beautiful, whole, and absolutely good that I was. Spiritually, what are you? Asked Imelda Shanklin. She says in reply, you are a soul that has forgotten its divine identity. A soul now struggling to remember in the midst of time and in the confusions of experiences that you are the living son or daughter of the living God. As Jesus said, I and the Father are one. I am one with God. The personal part of me, the subjective part, is not the truth of my being. It is the seen, the manifest, the body, my conduct, my situation, my jobs, my careers. The impersonal, however, is the unseen back of all life. It is spirit, divine mind, pure revelation, union, communion. The personal who can be changed, and we change it regularly in our lives. Each of us has changed and will continue to change throughout our lives. But in all of our changes in relationships to the world, only the who is concerned with all that business. The what of us is never affected. The what of us is never affected. That is changeless. It eternally will be what it eternally is. You will eternally be what you eternally are. It is the divinity of which Peter said in that moment of insight, you are the son or the child of God. So in conclusion, most of us at some point, right, in our life journeys, usually more than once, are called to look within, to the depths of our own being, to awaken to a fuller knowing of our authentic selves, to know what I would consider that part of our being that is whole, that is perfect, and that is absolute good. For me, this wake-up call occurred because of my addiction. For others I've known, it occurs at the time of a loss of identity, of personal identity of some sort, like through a divorce, a career loss, job loss, or possibly through an accident. Sometimes that kind of revelation can just occur because of somebody's Sunday talk. A moment of insight that wakens us, right? Really, because the truth of it is that any moment, if we are on this path, any moment offers us the opportunity to wake up more fully to our spiritual identity as God, as spirit, as beauty, as love, as prosperity. And as we do so, we come to live amidst the changes of life in a center of peace, the peace that passeth all understanding. We can indeed enter this kingdom of heaven by making it a practice to honor and then to testify to the wholeness in the midst of appearances to the contrary of brokenness, whether apparently in ourselves or in the people around us. Oftentimes we're more likely to see it in people around us. We can honor the wholeness in the midst of apparent brokenness, in the midst of apparent imperfections of those around us and of ourselves. As we do this, as we practice doing this, whether for ourselves or for another, we begin to come home to ourselves, to our identity. What are you? My answer to this question, what are you, is I am Christ, whole and perfect, the living child of the living God. You know, many people have said that I'm so courageous because of the ways in which I've just left all these things behind, like my home and my career and all these things to pursue my call to ministry. But I've actually never seen it as an act of courage. I've always held it as an act of faith. And this is why. Interestingly enough, if you study the 12 powers that Charles Fillmore teaches, the Apostle Peter actually represents the power of faith. And unity defines faith as the perceiving power of the mind, linked with the power to mold universal substance. It's the power of the mind to see the unseen, and by seeing it, make that spirit more manifest in the earth. So my power of faith is my power to see the truth of my own being and to help that truth, that goodness be more expressed in the world. It's that faith in God and me that allows me to continually shed my worldly identities and follow the call of Spirit that is in me and that is in each of us. There's only one power and one presence. Tag, you're it.